Hi Dave here. Quick reaction video to clickbait video put out by Dan McLellan. This video is called Debunking Alex O'Connor, and it's actually about debunking a guy who tried to debunk Alex O'Connor. So in that video, Alex O'Connor is presented arguing with he's presented arguing that the guys he's with can't remember what he said 20 seconds ago. So there's no way that the gospel writers could accurately remember what Jesus said, like writing the gospels years or decades later, right? So the Christian dude responds by pointing out that the premise of the gospels is that they were written with the assistance of the Holy Spirit. So kind of not the same thing. Well, Dan McLellan jumps in here with withering scorn to school Christian dude. Dan claims that the Christian dude is begging the question because he is relying on the verbatim, Dan makes a big deal about verbatim for some reason, gospel witness in order to establish his claim that the gospel writers relied on the Holy Spirit. Now, I think Dan's obviously confused on this point. It obviously doesn't matter whether the gospel account in John 14 is verbatim or not. But Dan's also confused on the begging the question issue. Dan cleverly, he thinks, asks the stumper question, what if that's not actually what Jesus said? You know, what's found in John 14. Right, well, then it's not what he said, right? But on the other hand, what if that is actually what Jesus said? Well, good question, right, Dan? Or are you just going to beg the question and assume that it's not what he said? So what Dan fails to note about Alex's argument is that Alex is at least equally begging the question as Christian dude, because Alex presupposes that the gospel writers, vis-a-vis remembering the words of Christ, and verbatim or otherwise is an irrelevant red herring. The gospel writers, he assumes, were in the same position as the dudes Alex is chatting with, vis-a-vis remembering what Alex said. And that just begs the question against the claim made by the John 14 guy, which is that the gospel writers, unlike Alex's podcast bros, had the assistance of the Holy Spirit in writing the gospels. So Alex is just begging that question against Christian dude. So to summarize Alex's question-begging argument, he says, you dudes don't remember what I just said to you 20 seconds ago. Then he makes the question-begging assumption that there's no relevant difference between his dudes and the gospel writers. And he concludes, so there's no way the gospel writers could have accurately remembered what Jesus said. Okay, that's begging the question, though. So here's a thought for Dan to ponder before he wades into quickly with question-begging accusations of question-begging in the future. Sometimes one man's modus ponens is another man's modus tollens. So in this case, we can start with the premise: if you couldn't remember, they couldn't remember, right? So if we want to have a modus ponens here, we say, well, you couldn't remember, so therefore they couldn't remember. But we can equally go modus tollens with that premise and say, but with divine assistance, they could remember. So yeah, with divine assistance, you too could remember. Yeah. So the moral of the story, do remember that textbook fallacies are mainly for teaching fallacies to children, right? Their intelligent use in the real world tends to be a little trickier than the textbooks let on. So be careful out there.